Over the last 2 days, we've heard from Chief Superintendent Darren Campbell of the RCMP, who served as Superintendent of Support Services for RCMP H Division during the mass casualty. Today, we'll be joined by another senior RCMP officer. Chief Superintendent Chris Leather will explain his role as Criminal Operations Officer for the RCMP in Nova Scotia at the time of the mass casualty, including how information was managed during this critical incident, how the RCMP interacted with other police services, and how information was shared with the public. By hearing directly from senior RCMP officers, we also hope to learn from them lessons learned, changes made to date, and opportunities for additional improvements to make our community safer in the future. I will now ask Senior Commission Counsel Rachel Young to get us started for the day. Ms. Young.
Thank you.
We're ready for Chief Superintendent Chris Leather.
Thank you. We'll have the witness come forward, please.
I understand he wishes to be sworn.
Just place the Bible in your right hand, please. Do you swear that the evidence you're about to give should be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do so swear.
Thank you. Be seated, please.
You were interviewed by the Commission for a full day on July 6, 2022. On that day, we discussed your role and what you did on April 18th and 19th, 2020. You explained what the role of a CROPS officer is, a criminal operations officer, which is what your role is in H Division. You talked about critical incident preparedness and how that is done in H Division, your views on the critical incident response in this case, relations between the RCMP, the Province of Nova Scotia, and Nova Scotia Municipal Police Forces, the work of the H Division Issues Management Team, the Alert Ready System, your April 28th, 2020 conference call with Commissioner Lucki, and the SiRT investigation. I do not intend to go over all of that same ground today. Today, what I want to ask you about is a little bit about your role and your background, and talk to you about information management and critical incidents from a bit more of an analytical standpoint, post-event communications and press conferences that you took part in, some new information about the context of the April 28th, 2020 meeting with Commissioner Lucki, or the phone call that we've learned since your July 6th interview. I want to talk to you about discussions of after-action reports for the mass casualty events, the structure of policing and audits of policing in the province of Nova Scotia, some more context for the issues management team, and questions about interoperability and some discussions you had with other police forces after the mass casualty. So that's our agenda for today. Starting with yourself, your education role and professional background, can you tell the commissioners what your general education is outside of police training?
As a graduate of both University of Western Ontario and York University, 2 BAs, one from each institution, and I'm a graduate of the Ontario Police College in Elmer. I started my police service with York Regional Police. I served there for just under 15 years and came to the RCMP in 2004, where I've been ever since.
Where did you work in your first 10 years, between 2004 and 2014?
In the GTA, or Greater Toronto Area, in national security, and particularly in human source development, or what's referred to as the source development unit.
And I understand in 2014 you were assigned the role of Operations Officer, Integrated National Security Enforcement Team in British Columbia?
That's correct.
In 2017, you assumed the role of Commander of Serious and Organized Crime in the Combined Special Forces Enforcement Unit in the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, is that right? Yes,
it's in the federal sphere of policing for the RCMP, but it's the best way to draw a parallel here is I was the GTA district officer for the RCMP, but there, serious and organized crime and CFSU fall under that role, so that's correct, and I was there for a couple of years.
And it was in September of 2019 that you became the Criminal Operations Officer for H Division and moved to Nova Scotia, is that right?
That's correct.
And that was the position you were in during the mass casualty events?
It is in the position I am in today as well.
I understand that you have a new posting as of next month.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Sorry, transferred to our national headquarters, back into federal policing, into the federal modernization project, which is underway out of headquarters, and it impacts all of federal policing coast to coast for the RCMP.
And when you worked in British Columbia, did you come to know Darren Campbell or Janice Gray, Lee Bergerman, anyone that you ended up working in H Division with?
Darren and I met for a cup of coffee, literally. He was on his way out to national headquarters. So I met him once there, but certainly Lee Bergerman and I both worked in federal policing. She on the serious and organized crime side, myself on the integrated national security enforcement team, but still under the same federal umbrella. And Janice Gray and I and John Robin as well all met while I was serving in E Division as well.
John Robin is Janice Gray's spouse?
Yes.
I'm going to turn to post-event communications and press conferences that you took part in. You'd agree with me that the RCMP should keep the public informed as to the status of major cases?
Yes.
Do you think that providing timely and accurate information builds public trust?
Yes, I do.
Is maintaining the public trust important to the RCMP?
Yes, it is.
There are also various policies that outline some information that must be withheld at times by the RCMP, for example, evidence that would compromise an investigation. And so maybe we can just scroll to the top so that the witness can see what this is. So that's, you can see it's from the RCMP intranet there, which is where policies are housed for the RCMP.
Yes.
And then what's at the bottom of the screen now is the RCMP will not release information that would compromise investigations or individual rights. You'd agree with that?
Yes.
Does that accord? Well, actually, we'll just look at another one before I ask you the next question. It's Comm 39872. This is a policy on media releases. There's a directive to ensure that information released to the media doesn't interfere with an investigation or arrest, or reveal police methods of investigation or security measures taken in the protection of property or persons. You'd agree with that?
Yes.
So do those things I've read you accord with your understanding of the parameters of a senior RCMP officer speaking to the media?
Yes, they would.
Given these policies and the importance of transparency, do you agree that if the RCMP has key information about an event, like the mass casualty, it should release that information to the public unless there's some recognized reason not to?
We should do our very best to release the information to the public, yes.
So how did you know what information, when you went to a press conference, was information that shouldn't be released to the public versus should? Did you have any role in making that decision? Or, you know, for example, how are the remarks prepared? And then how did you know if you got questions, how much you could say?
Well, so two very different parts to that, because when I think of a press conference, I really think of it in terms of two distinct elements. The prepared lines, which I was provided with, the commanding officer would be provided with by communications, knowing that corporate communications had done their due diligence in terms of discussing the contents with the command triangle to ensure that there were nothing in the contents of the speaking points that could negatively impact the investigation, for instance. That's a key piece, and that was done with certainty. But in terms of preparing for the Q&A portion, we might have had minutes to discuss what possible questions might arise during the course of the question and answer period, which I found to have limited help to me in terms of preparing. There were a number of questions which I was not prepared for in terms of having any sense going into the press conference that it would likely be asked, having the limited experience that I did in those types of scenarios, and really more by virtue of the lack of time in the lead up to giving the press conference, where I would have liked to have had a more fulsome discussion with corporate communications around that, due to the time crunch normally, being handed the talking points sometimes with 5 or 6 minutes to go before going to air. Those conversations were nearly impossible to have.
Why was it that there was time pressure like that?
Well, the dates for the press conferences would be set by corporate communications with the media outlets, and those dates were normally known with a few hours in advance or the day before, but not with a great deal of time. And once that was established, then corporate communications would begin churning out the media lines, making the consultations internally and often with national headquarters that they needed to make to ensure that the lines were in line with policy and weren't going to have a negative impact on the criminal investigation in the case of 𝐻-Strong and Portapic. I could tell, and I know that that was very difficult for our corporate communications staff to be able to achieve at times to meet the needs for the three of us initially. That's Assistant Commissioner Bergerman, Chief Superintendent Campbell, and I, to have those separate speaking points, to be ready to have any amount of lead-up discussion prior to delivering our message and working through the Q&As. So the Q&A portion, clearly the more difficult piece, for me certainly, I can speak for the others, because it's unscripted. You obviously don't know what is going to be asked, and doing your very best to try to remember what you've learned over the last day, hours in the case of the first press conference, after a series of briefings, updates, phone calls, and to recall best you can when asked about statistics, numbers, scenes, and I'll say it right now, obviously I missed the mark on more than a couple occasions.
Did you ever intend to mislead or hide information in press conferences?
Absolutely not. I intended to do the opposite. And, if we think about the now infamous in excess of expression that I used, it was done with my intention to not upset, offend, mislead, because I was receiving, as my notes show, conflicting numbers throughout the day or the hours leading up to. And I was more concerned about giving a victim total that was over what it truly was or in excess of. And by going to the number that I chose, it in fact ended up having the opposite effect.
And what you're referring to there is you said in excess of 10 people died, but in fact you had been told there were more than that. Is that correct? Is that what you mean?
I had received information leading up to that particular statement that I made that was truthfully in excess of 10, perhaps closer to 15 if we're going to put a mark in the sand. But the problem was it fluctuated depending on who was providing me the information. It was 14, 17, back down again, and I was quite concerned with the information I was reading in terms of the inconsistencies, and at one point in a discussion with Leah and I, we agreed we just need to cut this off, put the number piece aside, and go with a number, and we'll call it a stairwell conversation, is what led to me using that term that you asked me about in particular.
When you say Leah, you mean Leah Scanlon,
Leah Scanlon.
Director of Strategic Communications for H Division at the time. Okay, so as I think you mentioned earlier this morning, after the April 22nd briefings, Superintendent Darren Campbell took over, and he appeared at 2 further press conferences on April 24th and 28th, respectively. And why was the decision made to transfer the spokesperson role to him?
As I spoke of earlier, as the press conferences evolved from being what they were early on, which was for a wider advisory to the public at large about the tragedy, it became more focused and operationally driven in terms of the updates, and became almost exclusively operational or investigative timeline updates for the public. And it was decided that Chief Superintendent Campbell was best positioned to give those on his own, given his experience, his file knowledge, and his presentation skills. So it was a very short discussion, and it seemed like the obvious path to take.
He was one level closer to the investigation than you were, I take it?
Yes, he was.
And did you approve Superintendent Campbell's remarks in those conferences?
No.
Did you play any role in preparing for those media events?
We would have brief discussions beforehand, but I didn't play any role in terms of the talking points or the creation of the timeline. That was between Mr. Campbell and Leah Scanlon and others in corporate communications.
And so if there was a concern that there was a capacity issue with the PSAPs, were you involved in taking any action about that to make sure that didn't happen?
Well, the PSAPs, so the PSAP load or overload issue was the topic of many discussions in the Senior Officials Committee between Superintendent Rodier and EMO herself early on, and Glenn Byrne at that level. In the internal working group as it deals with alerting. So this was a topic of much discussion across a number of working groups and committees. So yes, and the conduit for us to the PSAPs is through EMO. They're the natural area for us to be dealing with in those conversations. They have a responsibility, an oversight responsibility, or even a governance responsibility when it comes to the PSAPs in terms of their ability to provide the service. So that's what we did, and there were many conversations, not just about the overload or perceived overload, but what technically can be done to address this issue, if anything. So yes, these were germane to what we noted early on, and those conversations continue today. It's an unresolved issue.
There's also managing the 911 call volume by discouraging it in the first place in a good way. I mean, you said you would never do that in terms of telling the public not to call 911 unnecessarily, but in fact, we heard evidence from an expert on public alerting, Michael Hallows, in May, who said it is important when there's no crisis going on to inform the public, don't call 911 to say, should I pick up my children, and things like that. And so has the RCMP undertaken any efforts to do that kind of public education?
Well, there's certainly been a number of discussions around that as well, and I can tell you that there was quite a lively debate on whose responsibility it was to even provide the public education. And this goes particularly back to the time before we had direct access, where EMO were the gatekeepers for this system. Will continue to be to this date. We have permission from them, of course, to be using their system for direct access, which is, of course, a branch of the provincial government. And so it would be inappropriate for us to go out on our own to begin some sort of public education campaign. What we sought to have was a joint public education campaign with all the chiefs, with the MO, Department of Justice. And these would be the very sorts of things we would have liked to have seen on a website, for instance, through messaging to the public, akin to what they do in the US. And these are the very conversations that we had around what Homeland Security does. They're decades ahead of us on these issues. We don't need to reinvent the wheel here. Much of the heavy lift in terms of best practices, public education, is already established, up and running, and has been for years.
In your commission interview on July 6th, you told us about your recollection of a meeting on April 28th, 2020 with Commissioner Lucki. That was right after the press conference that Superintendent Campbell had that day.
Yes.
I gather that you've read Chief Superintendent now Campbell's notes of the meeting and that you agree with his recollection?
Yes, on both counts.
And so I'm not going to take you through your account of the meeting again, but I will ask you for some additional context and take you through some emails that we did not have at the time of your commission interview. In his interview with the Mass Casualty Commission on July 12, 2022, Chief Superintendent Campbell told us that he thought you had forwarded either the NWEST report and/or an email from Sergeant Payton to Commissioner Lucki with the firearms details. Was he right about that?
No, that's incorrect.
Okay, can you tell us whether and how you forwarded firearms information to the Mass Casualty to or towards Commissioner Lucki?
I did forward the firearms inventory provided to me by Sergeant Payton at my request to Sergeant Payton to Assistant Commissioner Bergerman by email. So it was a forwarded email within minutes of receiving it, minutes of receiving it from Sergeant Payton.
And why, who asked you to do that?
To forward the email?
Yes.
Well, both the commissioner in terms of the original request, but in terms of the specific email, the CO or Ms. Bergerman asked for the inventory so she could pass it along.
For what purpose?
To pass it along because the commissioner had requested of me to obtain the gun inventory. And this is what I was able to achieve with Sergeant Payton's assistance. After all, he had done that on behalf of SiRT and 𝐎𝐻, and then to pass it along to Assistant Commissioner Bergerman only made sense following the chain of command back up to the commissioner.
And at about 1:56 p.m., you said you received a call from Commissioner Lucki on April 22nd, 2020, requesting the gun inventory. Is that right?
That's correct. I was at my desk and I got a call on my cell phone from Commissioner Lucki.
And you said in the parliamentary hearing that given the gravity of the situation, you did not think the request was strange, and that you had a conversation with then Assistant Commissioner, now retired, Lee Bergerman, and then Director of SiRT, SiRT, Pat Curran, C-U-R-R-A-N. Is that right?
That's correct. There was a teleconference with Mr. Curran, CO Bergerman, and I about the gun inventory.
So that was before you sent it anywhere, you spoke to them, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And that was a telephone conference call?
And really, when I say conference call, CO Bergerman and I were in the same room, but Mr. Curran was at his office, so that's how we spoke.
Was there anyone else on the call?
Not at our end, certainly, and I don't believe Mr. Curran had anyone else on the line.
You said in the parliamentary committee hearing that what was agreed in that conversation was that you would be allowed to provide the firearms inventory to the commissioner so long as it was used within the RCMP and that was it. Is that right?
That's what Mr. Curran had asked of us, that it was fine to provide the inventory internally And secondly, to obtain the inventory not from SiRT directly, but from Sergeant Payton from NWEST, who had done the gun inventory in the first instance for SiRT.
What is NWEST?
National Weapons Enforcement Team.
And then I understood you to say in the parliamentary committee hearing that there was no further conversation until April 28th, 2020 about the gun inventory. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. In your commission interview, you didn't mention this contact with the commissioner and the commanding officer on April 22nd and 23rd, did you?
At SECU or in my interview?
In your witness interview? On
No,
April
not in the
26th.
interview.
Okay. And why was that?
I'm not at liberty to answer that without speaking to counsel.
Okay. The commissioner's reaction to the April 28th, 2020 press conference, the content or lack thereof that was given out, was a complete shock to you. And that was because you hadn't been a part of the discussions with the communication team leading up immediately to the press conference. Do you recall that?
Well, both the communications team and/or Superintendent Campbell, correct. 5 days or so had passed. The gun inventory had been shared. And here we are on the 28th, moving into a call where that would be a live issue again. And for me, it was the first time this issue had surfaced in 5 days.
And you gathered from being in the conversation April 28th that the commissioner had been expecting information about the firearms to come out at the press conference, right?
Yes, certainly as the call went on, that became clear.
Had you been expecting that information to come out at the press conference based on the fact that you'd passed the information along?
No, not at all. I passed that information along with the thought that it would be shared by the commissioner with her senior executive within the force. That would be normal with her deputies. And so for me, that's where that disclosure to the commissioner through the assistant commissioner would have ended.
Before the press conference and that meeting, you must have known there was interest in these details about the firearms from Ottawa.
I knew there was interest, but I didn't think of it any more than, as I've explained it, as being something of organizational interest internally. I knew there had been some discussions about what could we release in the media in and around the 23rd, but not in the day or two leading up to the press conference. So it took me a few minutes, I would say, during the course of the conference call of the 28th to really piece it together, because not to say that it was a dead issue, but that it was an issue that was being managed on the side. And I knew that, I had a pretty good idea at least, that Superintendent Campbell would not be disclosing any of the finer details about the firearms during his press conference. That would have been shocking to me, and of course he didn't. And in fact was asked about the firearms in the Q&A session afterwards and was fairly guarded in his response.
Prior to the meeting, the conference call with Commissioner Lucki, the request to send the firearms, did you understand that to be only for her, or did you understand the interest to be from the Minister or the Prime Minister's office?
I had no idea what her interest was beyond her asking for the firearms.
Would that be an ordinary type of request for the Commissioner to ask for details about an investigation like that?
Hard for me to say because I've never been involved in anything that even remotely approaches this. It would be somewhat unusual for the Commissioner to call a crops officer directly, but not unheard of, because I would expect that that probably did show up as an agenda item, quite frankly, on an internal discussion with the SAC or the Senior Executive Committee. Unusual, but not unheard of.
One distinction I recall being made in the hearing on Monday was the difference between the treatment between the guns that were used and the guns that were seized. Can you please explain what that means and whether there's anything different about the way information about them would be treated?
We're talking about from the gunman out of his vehicle, say versus all firearms seized from any other location, that distinction would be relevant, you know, between the locations of the seizure of any firearms or ammunition.
And this soon after the events, perhaps, were the firearms that were used in the offense still undergoing forensic testing, whereas guns that were seized perhaps weren't? Does that ring any bells?
It doesn't ring any bells for me.
And so those documents show that you forwarded document 20316 to Lee Bergman, who then sent it along to Brenda Lucki. And it's the email from Sergeant Payne to you. So was there more than one email like that?
No, there's only the one email that I forwarded to the CO with the gun inventory information.
And since you had received the request from Commissioner Lucki, you knew you were sending it to AC Bergman, but the purpose was to ultimately be forwarded to the Commissioner, right?
Yes, because Assistant Commissioner Bergman had come to me to ask for an update on the status of the inventory, and I went and, you know, chased it down essentially and got it to her. So we were very well connected in terms of the request and some urgency, I would say, if she was coming to see me about that. So what we see here is the email chain associated to that being passed along.
In your mind, when you forwarded it, was it going to go anywhere past Commissioner Lucki?
No.
Did anyone ever come back to you and ask if it could be sent to anyone other than Commissioner Lucki?
Nobody came to me to discuss that.
Did anyone come back to you to ask to vet, for example, the firearms list if there was contemplation of sending it out pursuant to a Freedom of Information Act request? Or anyone else at H Division, to your knowledge?
In H Division, no, and in fact, I don't even recall a discussion around disclosure, period.
Comm 0020807 is an email from Lee Bergman to Chris Leather, Brian Brennan, and Brenda Lucki, April 23rd, 2020. It's re-weapon inventory.
And that'll be marked 3986.
And it says, we have permission to release internally, getting it sent now. You should have it soon. Just talk to NWEST. They will send it shortly. You recall that?
No, I didn't, but there we have the caveat being associated to the phone call.
Right, so that makes sense to you?
It makes
in this
total
context?
sense to me. I'm glad to see it.
And so, do I understand you to be saying this means there was permission to release it within the RCMP but not outside of it, is that right?
Yes, that's my understanding.
And would you consider the minister to be outside the organization, to be outside the RCMP?
Yes.
And would you consider the Prime Minister to be, Prime Minister's office to be outside the RCMP?
Yes.
Of course, the province of Nova Scotia doesn't set RCMP policy, right?
Correct.
And the RCMP ultimately reports to the commissioner of the RCMP federally.
Yes.
So how do you reconcile the province's responsibility to set police standards under the Nova Scotia Police Act with the fact that the RCMP sets its own policies and is accountable to the commissioner?
It's a balancing act. It's and it's challenging because we're often squeezed between the two. We are governed by our policies, of course, both divisionally and national policy. But yet, our marching orders, if you will, come from the province. They're the contracting partner. They describe what our priorities and objectives should be across all areas of policing except for federal policing. That direction comes from Ottawa directly. And therein lies some of the rub, but is also why it's so important that the commanding officers and her team and criminal operations have to maintain constant contact and relations with the province through the Public Safety Division of Department of Justice because of the competing interests that we are trying to manage. And when we see issues arising or expectations coming to us from the province that we think are going to create difficulties for us in terms of potential policy or even conflict with national policy, that's an example of where we have to, the CO and I in particular, have to engage with our counterparts to work through those challenges.
And just so we all understand who the players are, when you say contracting partner, you're referring to the province of Nova Scotia when you're talking about the contract being the PPSA, right?
Yes.
And the other signatory to the contract is the federal government, the government of Canada, as opposed to the RCMP, is that correct?
That's correct, Public Safety Canada.
But do I understand that most of the time it's the RCMP dealing with the province and not a different representative of the federal government as a whole, is that correct?
Yeah, the engagement between Public Safety Canada and the RCMP is almost exclusively in Ottawa. And where the interests of this province's Department of Justice and Public Safety Canada come together is at CMC, Contracting Management Committee. I could be wrong in terms of, but that's where all the Department of Justices meet with Public Safety Canada to discuss at the most strategic level trends, issues, challenges for the RCMP with the contracting partners, again, which is all the provincial governments except for Quebec and Ontario, where we're the provincial police. So very little contact, though, outside of those semi-annual meetings that they have. And our representatives are not the divisional COs, but in fact, the deputy commissioner and the commissioner is where that connection takes place.
Something on it, but can you tell us, to your knowledge, what is the number of positions on paper in the NXA and how that corresponds with reality?
My understanding is that's protected information, and it would require the release of the provincial government or Public Safety Canada. I don't believe I'm in a position to offer that. And
so perhaps without getting into numbers, are you able to say whether you know whether the full complement that is theoretically allowable under the PPSA has ever been fulfilled or funded by the province of Nova Scotia?
I can't speak to ever, but certainly in my tenure, it is not.
Can you give us an idea of the percentage of theoretically available positions that are actually funded by the province?
Well, I think the problem with that is easy math would be able to determine what the Annex A is based on our current establishment.
Okay, we'll come at that information another way. Who would have the power to fund those positions?
The primary funder is the province of Nova Scotia.
And who makes the decision to say, yes, here's your money?
Well, ultimately, it's the cabinet of the provincial government based on submissions from us through Department of Justice and in, as I understand it, a Treasury Board submission in the province once they've collected all of our multi-year financial planning and our budgetary information, which we go through on an annual basis with the province, year over year.
So the RCMP is bound to provide a certain level of service. If there were a case where the RCMP wasn't being given enough money to do that, is this an enforceable contract in the sense that the federal government could say, give us our money if you want us to do this service?
I've never heard of the federal government making such a statement. And I'm not aware, frankly, of their authorities if it ever came down to such a discussion.
Since it's the RCMP, you told us mainly dealing with the province and not a representative from Ottawa. What power, if any, does the RCMP have to go to the province, because the RCMP isn't a signatory, to say we don't feel we're being properly funded under the PPSA?
Well, these would be part of the conversations that the commanding officer and I would be having with our counterparts at the province. And it's inferred as well when we submit our budget proposals and our multi-year financial plan submissions, when we're asking for additional resources, it's because we don't feel we are sufficiently resourced. Otherwise, we wouldn't be making a submission. So there's a formal submission in writing, and there's the briefing and the dialogue, the context that goes along with that when we engage with our counterparts in government. So that happens, like I said earlier, formally twice a year in the semi-annual reporting that we do, and more informally half a dozen times or so during the course of our regular engagement with the province.
I'm going to ask you a big picture question and then try to ground it so that we can understand in a context that's relevant to the mass casualty. The big picture question is, can you describe how funding and governance arrangements impact the efficacy of operations from the top down?
You know, a complex question with probably not a very sophisticated answer would be, if we don't have sufficient funding to fill the cars, the specialized policing units, then of course it has an impact on efficacy. If we can demonstrate and show that we have significant deficits or we're depleted across the board in whether it's general duty policing, uniform policing, or specialized policing services year over year, and we can demonstrate that part of that is because there are budgetary constraints on us, and it's not just attributable to our off-duty sick and absenteeism, will both contribute drastically to our effectiveness and our efficiencies of your service.
Based on your experience in other provinces, do you have any insights or advice now that you're leaving Nova Scotia for how the province could move towards more integration or more efficient and positive sharing of police services?
Well, I think there has to be, and there has been, a change in the senior leadership of the RCMP, which will ought to remove any excuse from the municipal chief side that would stop them from wanting to engage with the RCMP in the division to build strong relations and to move towards a more integrated policing model. And you know, as sad as I am for leaving, I'm happy for the person coming in behind me. They will have a clean slate and an opportunity to engage with the municipal chiefs without any of this baggage that we've all carried around for the last 2 years, especially.
So it's positive that you're leaving, that's what you're saying?
For some, depends who you ask.
And Lee Bergman is retired, Janice Gray is retired, and Darren Campbell's also left the province.
Yes, and that's noteworthy. It's noteworthy in terms of relationships with the municipal police because, for me, again, to repeat myself, it takes away any excuse or reason why both agencies can't come to the table in a meaningful way in the very near future to drive the policing standards and interoperability and further integration of policing in this province.
Morning, Chief Superintendent. My name is Michael Scott. I'm counsel for a number of the victims' families and those that were directly impacted by the mass casualty. When you left here yesterday, I expect you heard Chief Commissioner McDonald confirm that you were to remain under oath before coming back this morning.
Yes.
And can you confirm that between when you left the stand yesterday to when you resumed your testimony this morning, that you have not been contacted or had any contact with anyone verbally or in writing with respect to the content of your evidence.
Correct.
Now, yesterday, Commission Counsel, in questioning you, raised a phone call that you had received on your cell phone from Commissioner Lucki. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And to the best of your recollection, can you tell us what the content of that conversation was?
The initial part of the conversation, and as I said, was the commissioner calling to me on my cell at my desk in my office, at the time on my own. Initially, it was wishing me all the best, and I would call it a wellness check. And then she quickly moved into, I would say, the reason for the call, which had to do with her request to me to provide her with a gun inventory of the guns that were found in the possession of the gunman on the day that he was killed at the Big Stop gas station, and to have that prepared and forwarded to her. Can't recall whether she said directly back to her or through the CO, but as I testified to yesterday, the normal course of action would be through the commanding officer and up the chain.
Did you say you received that phone call at your desk in your office?
Yes.
And was that on your cell phone?
On my cell phone.
Okay, your work phone or your personal phone?
My work cell phone.
And would it be unusual for the commissioner to contact you directly?
I think it's the only time I've heard from the commissioner directly over the last 3 years or prior to. Obviously, I've had one-on-one conversations with her where she's come to the division, but in terms of a phone call, that would be atypical.
And to the extent that you have communication with the commissioner at national headquarters, presumably that would come through the chain of command to you through people between you and the commissioner.
Well, certainly it would normally be the commanding officer, my direct report in the division, who would come to see me to pass on a request or a message from the commissioner or the deputy commissioner, typically.
Did it strike you as unusual that you were getting a direct phone call from the commissioner being asked about the gun inventory?
Yeah, unusual, but again, under the circumstances, the extraordinary circumstances, I could understand her wanting that information, as I said yesterday, for the purpose of informing her senior executive RCMP team. So that's the deputy commissioners and equivalents that sit with her, and surely we're sitting with her daily, if not more frequently, post the mass casualty event.
So that was your understanding, is the reason that information was being requested was to brief her own staff and also to make sure that she had a fulsome understanding of the facts surrounding the incident?
Yes, that was my understanding.
Did the commissioner say anything to you to indicate that, or is that just something that you assumed?
He didn't indicate to me, so that was my understanding.
Okay. Did the commissioner provide any indication as to the purpose for her wanting that information?
I don't recall that at all.
As my friend Ms. Young noted yesterday, that phone call never came up in the course of your interview with the Mass Casualty Commission, correct?
Correct.
And Ms. Young asked you why you didn't mention that phone call when you were being interviewed. And I think your response was that you couldn't answer, or you didn't want to answer that question until you had had a chance to speak to counsel. Is that correct? Did I hear you correctly?
I wasn't at liberty to answer that question at the time.
Okay. You know the answer to that question.
Yes, I do.
And in answering that question, would it require you to divulge the substance of any legal advice that you've received?
Yes, and for the commissioners, I would like to put it on the record at this time that I would like to waive my solicitor-client privilege in order to answer the question from counsel.
Ms. Ward, it's pretty obvious.
I would say that Chief Superintendent Campbell can waive his privilege for this limited purpose.
Thank you. Go ahead, Chief Superintendent Campbell. Please answer the question.
Yes, sir. So prior to coming to testify, I have spoken to independent legal counsel and have had discussions with him about this very issue. During the course of my preparation for my interview with the Mass Casualty Commission counsel, who examined me yesterday, there were two issues that I wanted to raise and did raise with Department of Justice counsel, Ward and McPhee, who are here today, and received advice from them. And the one issue that you're asking me about, as did Ms. Young yesterday, was a part of that discussion. And the advice that I received was not to proactively disclose the conversation and the emails leading up to the meeting of the 28th. I knew from my notes and the emails that I had prepared and submitted that it was obviously relevant to what would become the infamous phone call of April 28th and the subsequent SECU testimony of various witnesses, and was troubled by that and wanted their advice and was advised to take a reactive posture. My question was whether or not I should proactively disclose that during the course of my MCC interview.
If I could respond.
Ms. Ward?
I think there's been a misunderstanding as between Chief Superintendent Leather and counsel. I'm not sure, well, I didn't know until now what Chief Superintendent Leather understood from our discussion. Shortly before his interview with Commission counsel, he had raised a document of which we had no knowledge in the context of our discussions about the meeting with Commissioner Lucki. From his description of the document, we thought it was potentially relevant, but possibly privileged, and based on assurances of confidentiality given to those who were involved in the making of the document. As such, we told Chief Superintendent Leather we would obtain that document and review it and disclose it if it was relevant.
I do have to object. This witness is under oath testifying to the exact matters that Ms. Ward is now providing her narrative about, and I believe it's completely inappropriate for Ms. Ward to give her narrative on the very issue that this witness is testifying about at this very moment. It may impact his narrative based on Mr. Scott's follow-up questions, and I just believe it's completely inappropriate at this stage for this narrative to come forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bryson. Chief Superintendent Leather, why don't you step back outside, and to the extent that what might become evidence, part of your evidence, you won't hear the exchange. Ms. Ward?
Thank you, Commissioner. I wanted to say when we became aware of this document, which Chief Superintendent Leather had connected to discussions of the April 28th meeting, we immediately alerted Commission Counsel Director Mr. Cromwell of its existence and undertook to obtain the document and review it and state a position. We've now reviewed it and it will be disclosed imminently. At no time did we advise Chief Superintendent Leather not to speak about it if it came up and not to speak the truth. But we were unaware of any connection of that document to the call from Commissioner Lucki. So I'm not sure what the connection is, but I do not recall a discussion about the emails and the lead up to the meeting, and he was certainly, from our position, not advised not to tell the truth.
I don't think the issue was ever to tell the truth.
Or to hide anything.
I think it was proactive versus reactive. Oops, thank you, Ms. Ward. Let's call the witness back then. Mr. Scott, he's going to answer the question, and you're going to continue on with your questions.
I will, thank you.
Thank you, Chief Superintendent Leather. Mr. Scott will continue with his questions.
Chief Superintendent, I just wanted to get some clarification because you talked about, I think, a couple of different lawyers, and perhaps you were talking about your preparations for both your testimony before the Mass Casualty Commission, but did I hear also correctly you were referencing your preparations to give evidence before the House Commons Committee?
Well, I was specifically referring to the preparation for my testimony for the MCC interview.
Where you were interviewed by Ms. Young?
Where I was advised by DOJ counsel.
All right. And are you saying that that the lawyers that prepared you for that were counsel for the Attorney General of Canada?
Yes.
And that would be Ms. Ward and Ms. McPhee?
Yes.
Okay. And when you said that that you received advice to not raise the issue of this communication with Commissioner Lucki, was that advice given to you by counsel for the Attorney General?
Yes, I was trying to make the distinction between a proactive and a reactive disclosure of the information. That's the nature of the conversation we had. That, of course, if I was asked during the course of the interview or today, that I would respond truthfully and with the full extent of the question. But it had more to do with whether I should bring it up proactively during the course of my interview with Ms. Young or not. Okay.
And sorry, earlier you had mentioned that that you had sought advice from your own private counsel. That's a separate issue, is it? In terms of your disclosure of the call with Commissioner Lucki?
No, it pertains to this very issue post my interview, given my discomfort with how things proceeded and the fact that it didn't surface during the course of the interview. And I felt I needed independent legal counsel to get advice on how to manage the situation on a go-forward basis.
All right. So your testimony today is that in preparing to be interviewed by the Mass Casualty Commission, specifically by Ms. Young, you met with counsel for the Department of Justice, Ms. Ward and Ms. McPhee?
Yes.
And in the course of that preparation, you were advised not to bring up this communication with Commissioner Lucki?
Yes.
And it wasn't raised by Commission counsel in the interview?
Correct.
And to the best of your knowledge, the fact of that phone call had not been raised in any other forum before you were interviewed by Ms. Young?
To the best of my knowledge, it had not.
Right. You had no reason to think that Ms. Young would be aware of that phone call previously?
No, I had no reason to believe that, and certainly not from the interview.
And what you're saying is that after that interview was completed, you felt uncomfortable and sought independent legal advice?
Yes, here we are today dealing with this very issue, and on how to address this very issue should it surface. And here we are, and I felt I needed independent counsel on how to navigate that.
You were concerned that it might be viewed as you're improperly holding back relevant information?
Correct.
And you were fully aware of the fact that in being interviewed by the Mass Casualty Commission, that it was critically important that you provide all relevant information?
Yes.
And that's why you were uncomfortable and sought separate advice?
Correct.
Is there any other information that you were advised to not raise that you think is relevant to the substance of this inquiry?
There were two issues that I raised. One pertained to the phone call and notes around the commissioner. The second refers to what is known as a wellness review that was conducted on the senior officers of the division last summer and into the fall by an independent third-party consulting firm in Ottawa, focusing on the wellness of the senior officers in Nova Scotia related to the impacts from Portapic, and more specific to myself, I can say for certain that during the course of the interview that I had with the consultant or the investigator for that report, that I, on the record in a recording, made comments about the meeting with Commissioner Lucki on April 28th. So there we had a recorded statement taken from me that was provided by me to an investigator, albeit, as has been stated by DOJ counsel, on an internal matter, nonetheless contained my depiction or assessment of that call some year plus later, which would have had much more context than I had on the 28th, because, as you recall from my testimony, either here or at SecQ, how caught off guard by that I was, and then to learn what I did subsequently, and was then able to share my observations and thoughts about what had occurred on the 28th in much more detail to that investigator.
Sorry, what was the organization that conducted that?
Quintet Consulting. I don't know the rest of the name. They're a well-known firm in Ottawa that the RCMP hired to conduct this review.
And your understanding was that the scope of that review was to assess the impact of the mass casualty on senior officers?
Yes, and then to make recommendations on how we could, as a management team, look to support the wellness of the senior officers in the division specifically. It did not extend to the NCOs or the constables. It was just because of the impacts that we were seeing. In particular, 3 chief superintendents, Robin, Gray, and myself, and our correspondence to the deputy commissioner and the CO about the need to address this, come up with a plan, and implement some recommendations. And it was obviously the decision of headquarters to hire this firm, who are specialists, to conduct this review. And I can just say for myself, again, my statement would contain relevant information pertaining to the meeting of April 28th.
To the best of your knowledge, was Chief Superintendent Campbell interviewed as part of that process?
To the best of my knowledge, he was.
And do you recall who interviewed you in that process?
By name, no. He was a retired Navy captain, for what it's worth. I think he was the same principal that did, if not all, the majority of the interviews. But I'm sorry, I don't recall his name.
And approximately when was that interview conducted?
June or July of last year.
2021.
Yes.
To the best of your understanding, was a report of any kind completed in that matter?
Yes, it's my understanding.
And have you seen that report?
No, I have not.
Do you now, or have you ever had a transcript or a recording of the interview that you gave in that process?
No, and as I recall from the joining instructions, although a recording was taken for the purpose of assisting the investigator consultant, it was noted that it would not be retained, but a summary would be made from the interview.
Did you ever receive a summary?
No.
Okay. And you said that it would be relevant to the April 28th meeting that's been raised in this matter. And to be clear, you're talking about the meeting by teleconference with Commissioner Lucki and Superintendent Campbell and Leah Scanlon.
And Ms. Bergerman and Deputy Brennan, yes, that call.
And am I correct that the reason that that became a live issue in the interview that you did as part of that review was given the impact that meeting had on morale?
Well, for me, it was a one-on-one interview. It was based on the impact it had on me, and I was describing the impact that it had on me and why it had the impact it did, and my observations of the impact it had on the other people that I could see in the room with me.
And you said that the content of that interview that was taken last year would have information relevant to that meeting. Is there, to the best of your recollection, did you discuss anything in that meeting that would not already be known to the Mass Casualty Commission by way of your notes or the reporting of others?
Certainly by way of my notes, because my notes were admittedly rather brief as it relates to that meeting. So yes, there would be additional context and details because I had had the benefit of over a year to reflect and learn more about what had gone on in that key 24 hours beforehand in my discussions with Ms. Scanlon and Mr. Campbell.
And given that it was almost a year ago, presumably your memory would have been to some extent fresher than it is now?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I followed your question.
Does the fact that that interview was conducted about a year before now, do you have any sense that your memory at the time when you were recounting it in that interview would be better or clearer than it is now, given the passage of time?
I would say yes.
And bringing us full circle, do I hear you as saying that it was suggested to you by counsel that you not raise the fact of that interview in preparation for your interview with the Mass Casualty Commission?
I asked specifically whether I should bring that up proactively or not.
And what were you told?
Not to.
And who told you to do that?
It was Ms. McPhee and Ms. Ward that I had the conversation with in my boardroom at headquarters.
So when you talk about the two issues, one would be the fact of that interview, and the second was the phone call with Commissioner Lucki.
Phone call in my notes and the context and the lead up to the call on the 28th. And for my belief that was, now referring to the call on the 28th, that my role in the lead up to the 28th was a key piece of the story, which I began to tell at 𝐓𝐞𝐫𝐚 on the record. And it's on the public record there already, and of course, there's no reason why it shouldn't be available to the MCC.
Chief Superintendent, we heard earlier in the week from your former colleague, Chief Superintendent Campbell, and one of the things that he said in his testimony was that he was unsatisfied with the results of the 𝐻₋ investigation in terms of the ability to follow up on particularly issues related to how the perpetrator was able to obtain firearms. Do you share that view?
Yes.
Would you agree with me that a central part of the 𝐻₋ investigation, because the perpetrator's actions were fairly well known and his responsibility for the mass casualty was known, but there's this key issue of how is that person being permitted to access firearms?
That was a key part of the investigation.
To the best of your understanding, that person should not have been able to access firearms in Canada.
That's my understanding, yes.
It was known early on that he didn't have a possession and acquisition license.
Yes,
Certainly didn't have a restricted firearms license.
I would agree.
You were aware of no reason why he would be able to lawfully possess, purchase, or acquire any sort of firearm or ammunition.
He did not have such a license that I was aware of.
And to the extent that he was able to access or had assistance from others in acquiring those weapons, it would be your view that that directly contributed in a material way to his ability to kill 23 people.
Yes.
And in the course of that investigation, obviously, leads were followed cross-border to the United States, and certain individuals were identified.
Yes.
And while there are jurisdictional issues, it's certainly your view that the way the perpetrator was able to access several weapons is reasonably clear.
I believe the investigation has uncovered the, if not all, certainly the majority of sources of weapons that the perpetrator used in the U.S.
And it's your understanding that the American authorities, the ATF and FBI and specifically, have no intention of laying charges. That's the best of your understanding as the matter stands now.
Yes, I mean, I've not made any recent inquiries in that regard, but that's my understanding coming here today.
And to your mind, that leaves that issue unresolved, but to some extent beyond the control of the RCMP.
Yes.
I guess your colleague, Mr. Campbell, was asked about a meeting that he had with you shortly before Ms. Banfield was charged. Do you recall that meeting?
I do.
And it was suggested that in the course of that meeting, there was a discussion between you and now Chief Superintendent Campbell about whether charges would be laid in relation to Ms. Banfield.
They were updating me on the investigation, and were seeking my, well, awareness and support for next steps. And I think it's important to make the distinction. They weren't looking for my authority. This was not a formal, I needed to authorize what they were proposing. It was merely an update. This was a course of action that they had charted. And the next step, as I think you've heard from my testimony and Chief Superintendent Campbell, was that the command triangle would then pursue discussions with the advisory crown on the possibility of charges being laid. And I was fully supportive of that course of action at the time.
And I appreciate that you weren't being asked to make the decision, but do you recall in the course of that conversation, discussion about the potential optics of laying criminal charges against Ms. Banfield?
Yes.
And concerns over whether the victims' families would be supportive or not supportive, how it would look to the public?
Yes, the impact on the public, and that we needed to be cognizant that it would have impacts whether charges were laid or charges were not laid. And that was the nature of our conversation as it relates to that.
I suggest to you, did it not strike you as unusual to be having a conversation about what the optics of laying criminal charges would be? Would you not agree with me that that the issue is simply whether or not there is evidence upon which the RCMP, in good faith, believe that a case can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt? Well,
I agree, and that's what I testified to yesterday. We have a job to perform, a mandate to follow. That's the criminal investigation, which we pursued, and it was merely a conversation amongst 3 senior managers in the division, and I can't remember which of the 3 of us tabled that particular item, but that is normal. We're not just going to focus in a conversation like that strictly on, whether there's evidence or not to lay charges. Let's consider for a minute the impact that that's going to have on the families. What will the community think? And beyond that, a conversation with our corporate communications folks, because questions surely will be asked and were once that decision became public. So that's natural. These are the types of conversations I would expect the SSO and the officer in charge of major crime to be having with me in regards to something as high profile and important as that investigation.
in the context of that conversation is the nature of it, we're going to discuss the various factors in terms of the evidence that we have and how it will be perceived and how it will be received, leading to whether or not we should lay charges, or is it we think we have the evidence or we're in the process of making that determination, but we should also consider that this is going to have implications, or there may be a reaction. And I guess the distinction I'm drawing here is it a matter of we should be alive to the fact that our decision is going to bring questions or criticisms, but we're going to do whatever we think is right? Or was it your understanding that we're factoring in the public relations piece and making a determination about whether criminal charges are going to be laid against a citizen?
Well, the first scenario that you laid out, it's being aware and discussing the implications, but refreshing, not that it was required with two very senior major crime investigators. Our primary mandate is to investigate crime, to collect the evidence, to do the best that we can in doing so, and to present the case as we did, in my understanding that we did through the command triangle, to the advisory crown and to the prosecution service.
Regardless of whether it's popular or not.
We make many unpopular decisions when it comes to prosecution, or not prosecution, but forwarding cases to the prosecution service.
Would you recall ever any discussion or any communication or indication that a motivating factor in laying charges against Ms. Banfield or the other two parties was in any way motivated by a desire to delay or in any other way obstruct the Mass Casualty Commission's ability to secure documents?
You know, if you're asking whether we had discussions about that, I mean, the idea of even the sentiment of obstructing any agency is foreign to me, and certainly to those two other officers. And while we had discussed and were aware that the inquiry had just been called, it wasn't going to impact our decision on whether to continue with the investigation and present that to the prosecution service. As I noted yesterday in my testimony, we were going to pursue that with all our ability unless we were directed to do otherwise. And there are very few sources that can provide that kind of direction to have us halt an investigation, you know, for all intents and purposes, park an investigation. And I can just say for myself, we certainly did not receive any such recommendation or direction from any authority above us to do so. And we briefed up on this. You know, this is not a decision that was taken in isolation within the division. Our national headquarters, CNIP, were well aware of this status as it moved through the investigation. And so there was corporate awareness at the highest level of this, of our decision to continue the investigation and submit it to public.
Would it have been your view at the time or now that the charges involving helping the perpetrator acquire the necessary materials to carry out the acts minor?
My personal opinion, whether they're
Yes.
minor? I mean, I more look at the charges more clinically. The charges are what they are, and of course, depending on the circumstances, they may be looked at as rather benign in the terms of the scale of firearms offenses, right, that we typically investigate. But that, of course, is not the lens that I would look at these particular charges. They would be high profile, serious under the circumstances, and serious under the circumstances.
You'd agree with me that while often in firearms crimes there's a focus on accessing the firearms, the ability to access ammunition is no less important, is it?
If you don't, and again, I'm borrowing Chief Superintendent Campbell's analogy, without ammunition, the guns are metal and wood or metal, can be used, of course, as a weapon on their own to strike someone with. But once you combine ammunition with a firearm, stating the obvious, it becomes something else.
was it your understanding or the position of the RCMP at the time that the distinction between how the perpetrator acquired firearms and how he acquired ammunition, that there was any particular distinction between the two? Was it viewed as being just as important as tracking down the persons of interest in Houlton, Maine that had supplied the firearms themselves?
I'm not aware of any distinction that was made between, as you say, the different avenues of investigation in terms of importance. It would have had the same importance as any aspect of the 𝐻_strong investigation, but particularly where we had the evidence we had an evidentiary path to pursue that may actually lead to charges, was something that we were going to follow with our full capabilities.
Do I understand correctly that that after a SiRT referral has been made, and subject to some of the exceptions that you've been talking about, if the member involved in a certain investigation wants information from SiRT, they would not contact SiRT directly, correct?
I would not expect that to occur. I am aware now from my MCC interview that did occur. And if I'm being honest, that's the first time I became aware of that contact was actually during my interview. It would be inappropriate and highly unusual for such a call to be made. What I had said at the time was it wouldn't be unusual for the Police Federation to make inquiries, particularly for protracted investigations where things run into the many months or a year and beyond on behalf of a member, maybe, but the member directly, very unusual.
And to be clear what we're talking about, there was an incident in which Constable Terry Brown, who was one of the subjects of the Onslow Fire Hall shooting, contacted one of the SiRT investigators to get information about the investigation. That's your understanding?
Well, that's how it was described to me, and again...
Well, that's my question. I'm asking you, is that your understanding of what that was?
But that was actually what was shared with me in my interview. So, like, my understanding is rudimentary at best. So, was it more innocuous than that, or was it actually as it related to the, as you noted, an update on the status of the investigation? Because they would be very different. And I'm afraid I don't know what the content of that inquiry was.
So, until it was raised with you by Ms. Young earlier this month, you had not received any information suggesting that the subject of a SiRT investigation had reached out directly to SiRT investigators before that investigation was closed. That was news to you.
I don't recall hearing about that until my interview.
And subject to, hypothetically, if it were true that that is what happened, you would agree that would be an inappropriate contact between the member and SiRT?
If it pertained to the investigation, yes. If it was an innocuous request about something not related to the investigation, then perhaps there could be an explanation, but I don't know what was asked by Mr. Brown.
And presumably in those circumstances, you would expect that an explanation would be asked of the member to confirm whether this was appropriate or not, that there would be some looking into that issue.
Yes.
Hearing no objection. Chief Superintendent, I'm going to suggest to you that you're aware of an email that you were copied on May 6, 2020. And it appears to be an email from Costa Demopoulos to Pat Curran, the acting director at the time. And I just want to read to you some excerpts. It appears to be an email suggesting from Mr. Demopoulos to Mr. Curran that an issue has arisen with the videotape at the Enfield Big Stop. Do you know the email I'm talking about?
No, I don't.
All right. I'm going to suggest that you were copied on an email where Mr. Demopoulos is advising Mr. Curran that the owners of the gas station, Irving, have the original copy of the videos and that what the RCMP has and what SiRT has are simply copies, and that there was some concern that because the original copies were not in the control of the RCMP, that they may be released or leaked to the public. Do you recall a conversation or a discussion of that issue?
Vaguely.
And I don't know that you were copied on this email, but the passage that caught my attention is, I bring this to your attention, that being Mr. Demopoulos to Mr. Curran, as the RCMP does not currently control who may access these videos in the future at Irving, make copies or perhaps post them online. Should this happen, it would have implications for both our organizations, presumably the RCMP and SiRT. To the extent that Mr. Demopoulos, or Superintendent Demopoulos, is suggesting that the release of videos from the Irving Big Stop may have implications for both our organizations. Do you have any idea what he's talking about?
Well, this is May of 2020, so I'm sure he was quite concerned that had video footage found its way to the media and shown up online, it would not only have significant implications for the organizations involved in terms of the integrity of the investigation, but also the victims' families and the community. It's the last thing that they need to be watching. And Superintendent Demopoulos, again, with his experience, I see that email as him doing his due diligence and trying to flag an issue to Mr. Curran that he should perhaps be aware of. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. I don't know what the follow-up to that email exchange was.
Okay, but you agree with me that the fact of a third party who has, I mean, those videos were not released to Irving by the RCMP or, to the best of your knowledge, by SiRT. It was their own video. In what way would that have had any implications on the RCMP or SiRT if they were leaked by a party unrelated to the RCMP?
Well, I think if we look as a real example that's related to this file, and we think of the Armored Car Company video, for instance, that was leaked by someone online from when the gunman retrieved a cash payment, purportedly. And that was certainly early in the 𝐎𝐻𝐿 investigation. That's not helpful.
Sorry, how is that not helpful?
Well, there's an ongoing criminal investigation still as it relates to the video and his presence there, and it's all part of the 𝐎𝐻𝐿 investigation. I'm not saying that it's not helpful at some point to release it, but I doubt very seriously that either command triangle, SiRT or major crime, would be wanting or happy to learn that the video from the Big Stop was released with at least without a conversation with the Irving principals about that going out. So there's evidence integrity and investigative integrity issues at play for both organizations, as far as I can tell, from what would be key evidence collected by their security cameras at the gas station.
At the April 19th press conference, you indicated in response to a media question that the perpetrator was not known to police. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And that wasn't true, is it?
He was known to police. I would agree with that.
And at the time, you said that he wasn't known to police. You knew that that was untrue.
So going back to that particular...
Right, but I'm just going to, my question is, at the time you said it, you knew it was untrue. It wasn't a mistake, like suggesting that all the victims were adults. It wasn't an issue with recollection.
Well, I was trying to respond to your question by saying that going through my mind at the time was known to police, meaning has a criminal record, is known because he's a person of interest for intel purposes, And that's what was running through my mind at the time. I wasn't aware of any such, or I couldn't at least recall any such designation, and that's why I responded the way I did.
You were also asked whether the perpetrator's wife, children, and relatives were among the casualties, and your answer was, I'm not at liberty to answer at this stage. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And am I correct that in your very first briefing from Staff Sergeant Halliday at 6:30 in the morning, you'd been advised that the common law spouse, Ms. Banfield, was alive? Yes?
Yes.
And that there was this issue with the family in Moncton, and that RCMP in Moncton were protecting them?
Yes, I was aware of that.
And is there any reason why you could not have simply answered that question and said that, yes, we know his common law spouse is alive, he doesn't have any children that we're aware of, and his family appears to be fine as well?
That was done out of caution for the ongoing investigation. It was fair to say at the time that Ms. Banfield's status had not been clearly communicated to me, whether she was a victim, witness, or suspect. And the last thing I wanted to do was speak to her involvement in any shape or form so early after the incident.
Right, but what was clearly communicated to you was that she was alive.
Yes.
Right? But the question that was put to you was whether the perpetrator's wife, children, or relatives were among the casualties, not whether they were involved or whether they were suspects, but if they were casualties, and you knew at that point.
Well, I didn't know anything about whether there were children or parents or any other family members that resided with him, and I didn't feel comfortable answering that without knowing more about the familial situation that the gunman was involved in. I simply didn't feel comfortable answering that without having more information about his family status.
Right. And am I correct that the issue about things that cannot be shared, we talked about holdback evidence or evidence that may negatively impact the ongoing investigation. Those are police issues, right? Those are not strategic communications issues. As a matter of policing, you would be aware of why we would not be able to release that particular information.
Well, what I would agree with is you're up there on your feet trying to make those very determinations as the questions are coming at you with the limited briefings you've received on, let's say, the status of the investigation at that time. And they were limited, admittedly, so early after. And so you're struggling with the questions and your, in many cases, limited knowledge actually of the status of the investigation or the status of certain individuals, like I spoke about in terms of Banfield. And so the option is to say, not at liberty to discuss, or I'll have to update the public later. And that creates a whole host of issues unto itself, because then it appears to be, well, perhaps you're not misleading, but you're not sharing what you ought to be sharing. So that balancing act and accuracy with the pressure and the time constraints is almost an art unto itself, and we have work to do.
Perfect. The question that was posed to you by Ms. Young was, so if, God forbid, the same exact events happen today with the new policy and protocols in place, would an alert be issued? And I suggest to you, Chief Superintendent, that I would have thought that would have been the easiest question in the world. And it seems notable that the response that we have up on the screen says, first pauses for 16 seconds before answering. It's a very difficult question to answer because, unlike the principals that were in command, Halliday's, McCallum's, West, SiRT's, the issue of alerting is a situation that would have been fraught with risk for both the public and the police, and I think me opening that up is irresponsible because I wasn't there, and then you go on and on and on. As you sit here today, can we agree that when you read Ms. Young's question, if God forbid the same exact events happen today, with the new policies and protocols in place, with your knowledge of Ready Alert, can we confirm that the answer to Ms. Young's question is yes, we would send an alert?
No, I stand by the response I gave.
Very good. Those are my questions, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
I don't want to repeat all of what he had to say, but as I understood, and I thought he put it very well, he read you the passage. I don't understand, and can you help me and Nova Scotians understand why you can't answer yes, alert ready will be used in this province if a critical incident arises with a mobile active shooter like in Portapique on the 18th? Why won't it be used? Why can't you say yes?
Well, the response I was giving was the decision to deploy in that instance surely would have rested with the CICs, who were the most informed, were receiving updates, had familiarity with the location or not of the perpetrator. And to answer that question more effectively, and what I'd said in my interview with Ms. Young is I'd hoped one day that a proper analysis would be done of that case at some point, a study, if you will, or analysis. Because for me to say automatically in that circumstance we would alert without being in there at the time, albeit we know a great deal about the decision making that was going on and the information that was learned, I think is a irresponsible position to put myself in because I wasn't there. It's a better question for the CICs that were, particularly those who have learned about alert ready since there, and a number of them have. Because deploying that technology under the circumstances that we had in Portapique, with a perpetrator driving a police vehicle dressed as a police officer, there are significant public and officer safety risks associated to that would have had to have been analyzed and would have been analyzed by the CICs in a scenario such as that before they would agree or not to issue an alert. They would have to satisfy themselves that the need to inform the public using an alert was not recklessly going to put members of the public or police officers responding in harm's way by the issuance of the alert. And looking at this from the outside, it seems quite clear that that could in fact be a significant risk associated to a deployment alert under those circumstances.
Would you agree with me that if the same scenario that happened in Portapique was to happen in rural Nova Scotia tonight, and it's deemed a critical incident, that the critical incident commander has complete authority to direct alert ready be used in that situation without any other barriers in front of he or she?
I would agree with that.
Thank you. So my question to you is really a simple one. Did you come away from that call personally with the impression that there was political interference in the RCMP investigation of the mass casualty?
I did not come away from the call immediately feeling that. However, once I had the opportunity to learn more about the context, particularly of the lead up 24 to 48 hours, and reflect on, after I'd spoken to Lisa Scanlon and Darren in particular, to learn more about the speaking point debate, we'll call it, in terms of what could and couldn't be in it. So to answer your question, not immediately. Subsequently, yes, when I gathered all the facts and had an opportunity to learn what had occurred in those final hours before that press conference of the 28th.
So then is it your evidence today that you're of the impression there was political interference?
That's my impression.
For you. I just have a follow-up question on the wellness review that you spoke of earlier. So presumably this is information we do not have, that this commission does not have, to the best of your knowledge, correct?
I can't answer that, sir. I don't think so, but I really don't know what's been disclosed.
And would you agree that this information would be relevant in considering the impact that this mass casualty has had on its senior management?
On the senior officers in the division?
Yes.
Yes.
Are you aware of the RCMP formally engaging with Sergeant Bernard on the night of this mass casualty to advise Millbrook that this mass casualty was unfolding?
No, I'm not.
Okay. Now, in fairness to you, I will note that, that there was a Millbrook officer that was present on the evening of April 18th, but it's apparent based on the statement from Sergeant Bernard that, that the chain of command was not followed, in the sense that Sergeant Bernard was never made aware that, that this mass casualty was occurring, especially given the fact that he was 39 kilometers, that his area is 39 kilometers from Portapique, and also given the video evidence that has surfaced, where we know that the perpetrator actually pulled over in Millbrook, removed his jacket, and we have surveillance that has been entered as an exhibit here, and that was through Millbrook. So if we can, I'm going to ask you to take a look at Sergeant Bernard's comments. There's no limit, there's no words to describe how offended I am that I had to leave Millbrook that morning with zero information at, 10 o'clock, however many hours after this happened. I find it, ethically offensive, really. Were you aware of this sentiment prior to today?
No.
And are you aware of any RCMP efforts to contact Millbrook, contact its sergeant to advise of this unfolding mass casualty on April 18th or 19th?
I wouldn't be aware of the contacting of the detachment, no.
Do you accept that, that as a result of the RCMP's actions in this mass casualty, that the relationships with Millbrook have been strained, that the relationships with Truro Police have been strained?
Well, it's certainly based on, and this is the first time I'm seeing Sergeant Bernard's statement, that it's quite clear how he felt. But we've also, since then, as it relates to Millbrook, I was there myself at least twice, if not 3 times in the months afterwards, to meet with Sergeant Bernard and his staff. And he was, of course, as we already discussed, invited to the Bible Hill Detachment meeting, and to give him an opportunity to express his concerns, which he did, obviously here in his statement in great detail at the town hall. And I would suggest that since great efforts have been taken by my office and by the commanding officer through the admin and personnel officer to meet with and learn more from the members of Millbrook Detachment. As it relates to Truro Police, there's no question that relations between Truro and I would say the division, not so much Millbrook or Bible Hill Detachment, I don't think that's fair, that relations haven't been lower in probably many years, if ever.
And you recognize that, that the RCMP has work to do with First Nation communities?
Yes, of course we do.
And that's actually a comment that Sergeant Bernard makes on the previous page. But most of our leaders are very out of touch with what it's the modern demands of, tactical intervention. They're out of touch with communities. They're out of touch, especially with First Nations communities. These are Sergeant Bernard's words. Were you aware of this sentiment prior to today?
I was not aware of Sergeant Bernard's sentiments around that, no.
So that reads, since the perpetrator was able to purchase a decommissioned RCMP Ford Taurus and use it to create an almost exact replica of an operational RCMP car, the sale of all surplus RCMP vehicles was suspended. You're aware of that?
Yes, I am.
So I'm just wondering, the past tense there, it was suspended. Do you know if the sale is currently suspended or if the RCMP has begun to auction off those vehicles again?
That's my understanding. The suspension remains in place, and that's a Government of Canada directive, but more specifically for us from the Minister of Public Safety, and I'm not aware of it being amended or lifted.
So the next thing I want to ask you about, and this is a concern for my clients, and it's related to the issue of policing standards. So we've learned that during the response to this mass casualty that most members were traveling alone, so 1 member per 1 police car. Is that the norm for rural policing in Nova Scotia?
Yes, I would certainly say that there are many more 1 vehicle patrol cars than 2 persons, yes.
So during this incident, members have testified that they were traveling at very high rates of speed, well in excess of the posted speed limits, And my recollection is that we heard speeds of 167 kilometers an hour, 204 kilometers an hour on secondary winding roads to get to Portapique as quickly as possible. Are you aware of that evidence?
No, I'm not.
Does that surprise you that they would be traveling at that rate of speed to get to the crime scene?
Is it to a scene or is it in the hunt for the perpetrator?
Sorry, it's in response to the call out from dispatch.
If as you described it, I think you said windy roads or not, it does seem excessive, but having been in general duty or uniform myself, given the magnitude of the situation, I'm not surprised by those speeds because the members would have been doing everything in their power to participate and locate the perpetrator.
So in addition of driving to the scene as quickly as they could, members were also required to use their radios to receive and possibly to convey critical information, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And in addition, to use their mobile workstations to possibly figure out where they were going, where other members were, and possibly to do some background work to learn more about the incident?
Yes, I think
fair?
that it's fair that they could be reading messages on their mobile data terminal while driving to try to educate themselves, yes.
Okay. And presumably, would it be fair to say that they were also observing their surroundings, watching other traffic, and being alert to possible relevant information related to the call-out?
Yes.
So my question is this: given the requirements of police officers today, and in particular, the need for them to use technology, would you agree that a minimum policing standard would be 2 officers to a vehicle, 1 to drive safely, and the other to do everything else needed for effective policing?
Well, I think if that was a standard, while it would be optimal, look, that is the optimal state. The optimal state is we have 2-person vehicles. And some jurisdictions, particularly in more urban centers, have that. It's not I would say, a luxury that we have in this province, mostly due to resourcing constraints, as opposed to decisions to not put members together. And we should strive for an environment where we do have more 2-person, or what we refer to 2-man cars. But, and particularly in light of the backup situations where officers backing each other up could be many, many minutes apart. So again, having your partner at your shoulder in the patrol vehicle, of course, especially for those more remote patrol areas, is the ideal approach. And I think the detachment commanders consider that when they're deploying their members for those areas that are more remote from, we'll call it the center of the patrol area where the detachment's located. That's just good human resource deployment planning. But I think it's an ideal state that I'm not going to say may never get to, but we're a long way away from having that level of resourcing in our uniform detachments in the province.
So I want to put a couple of examples to you, and just to be clear, Chief Superintendent, I wasn't suggesting earlier, I wasn't criticizing the rate of speed. I think all Nova Scotians were very grateful that the officers got there as quickly as they did. So that wasn't the point of my question. It was really, are we asking too much of them? So we're talking about the period of time that we now know in hindsight was likely the getaway route of the perpetrator. So we learned from this that a witness on Station Road observed a police cruiser with flashing lights traveling quickly southbound on Station Road toward Portapique. And then 2 to 3 minutes later, he saw a cruiser that looked like a cop car traveling northbound at only 70 kilometers an hour. And the witness says the flashing lights weren't activated and it had its regular headlights on. And then shortly after that, the witness reports hearing a siren and seeing the red and blue flashing lights from another vehicle driving south towards Portapique at a high rate of speed. So we now have the GPS data that indicates that the witness may have seen Constables 𝐎𝐲𝐿 and Blinn. We know that neither of these officers reported seeing the perpetrator. So this is an incident where would resources, in hindsight, have justified somebody in the passenger seat who might have been able to watch the road around them and let the other officer focus on driving?
There's no question whether it's a surveillance operation in plainclothes or in uniform patrol, two sets of eyes will always be better than one, and particularly under circumstances like this where we're actually in the throes of trying to locate a vehicle or an individual. It's a force multiplier of more than just one, because likely that passenger is not nearly as engaged as the driver is in all the other things that you already described. You know, I don't know what the force multiplier would be, but it would be more than double. Yes, so the power that that brings in terms of observation is significant over a one-person police car. I would agree.
With respect to Corporal Peterson and the Highway 4 in Glenholm, would you agree that somebody in the passenger seat may have made it easier for Corporal Peterson to respond quicker and more confidently after having seen the perpetrator?
I think the first scenario that you shared is a more likely scenario where it would have made a difference. With Corporal Peterson not knowing the topography, the lay of the land exactly, and only what I do know about the perpetrator's activities after he saw Peterson going the other direction, maybe it would have made a difference.
So to the extent that there may have been some reluctance or lack of confidence in terms of the ability of Corporal Peterson to engage the perpetrator, would somebody at his side have assisted that?
I don't know about Corporal Peterson's reluctance to engage the perpetrator. Common sense dictates that any time we have backup beside us or nearby, it does have an impact on our members in terms of boosting their confidence, of course, because you feel like you're in a more fortified position when you're dealing with a threat.
Can we agree that had the perpetrator faced two officers in Constable Morrison's car and two in Constable Stevenson's vehicle, that there could have been a different outcome?
Yes, of course.
Since there are at least two members in an IRT vehicle when responding to a call-out, the driver can focus on the road while another member receives and sends information through the various tools available to them, which now includes the mobile workstation. So again, I think you've answered the question, but ideally, the same would apply to general duty members as well for more effective policing?
Yes, well, more effective because now your say passenger in this situation can look after the data management issues that are going on in terms of updates on the call that you're attending, any updates in terms of the movements of the suspect that you may be looking for, or witnesses or complainant. And of course, the driver's not having to do that whilst driving, while communicating with the OCC. So again, I think it's fairly obvious that that makes it a more effective response when you have two members in a car.
So the obstacle to giving Nova Scotians that a more effective response is resources and funding, in your view?
Yes.
So,
Chief Superintendent Leather, thank you. Thank you for helping us with our very challenging tasks, and we have difficult conversations every day in our work, but they're very important conversations, and we really appreciate the fact that you've been here for 2 full days, not just answering our questions, the collective hour questions, many of them very difficult, but necessary, but also thank you for your insights. We really appreciate it. So you've assisted us with our work, and for that we're very grateful and appreciative, and You're free to go, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.